This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
All right, episode 1 of the Practice Squad Throwback, new podcast we're bringing out, and I'm excited to do this. Of course, let's start with what's going on here. The NFL Game Pass, which has every NFL game, or, well, most of them, since 2009, I believe, is the start date. It has them in multiple forms. They have full game broadcasts, condensed broadcasts, which is basically you see all the plays. They just cut everything else in between out. Coaches film, and I don't know, was there anything else in there that I'm missing, Stroz?
They had the coaches film, which is weird. They had the condensed version, which I think is fantastic, but a little bit herky-jerky.
Yeah.
I've watched it that way, and I kind of felt like I was missing stuff. And then they have the full game, the full broadcast without commercials. Now, that takes quite
2.5 hours.
Yeah, it takes quite a long time.
So if you want to watch along with us, the way we're going to do this, every podcast is going to be two weeks of games. And somewhere in there, because 2011, of course, was a season, the Lions, I should have mentioned that, we're going to be following the 2011 Lions, but every podcast will be 2 weeks, except one will have to be 3, because the 2011 Lions, of course, played a playoff game. They played 17 games. We'll figure that out on the go. This has been a very, figure it out as you go podcast, but just something fun we thought we could do while there's no sports. If you want to watch along, you want to watch full games, awesome. You want to do condensed, awesome. Stroz, myself, I watched the first half of week 1, full broadcast.
Yep.
And that's the way I kind of wanted to go about it. But after doing that, I think I'll probably watch some games that way. Specifically, I know when we get to week 5 and the Monday Night Football against the Chicago Bears.
Dude, that game was crazy.
I was there. I was at all of these games. I've been a season ticket holder for a long time. I'm obviously not anymore being in Texas. But that day, I'm not kidding. I don't know if it's top 5 anymore. At that point in my life, it was easily a top 5 moment in my life. It's still probably top 10. That was one of the coolest experiences ever. So I'll probably watch the full game broadcast of that. But I watched the second half of week 1 on just the condensed. I watched all of week 2 on condensed. But again, it's herky-jerky, but it's important to note you're not missing any plays. You still see every play. They just cut out everything else in between.
Yeah, I watched the first game on the condensed version, and I was like, wow, that kind of flew by. That was really fast. Like you said, you don't miss anything. It's just kind of, they're just hard edits is all it is. They're just hard cuts.
You almost wish there was an in-between, right? Because 2.5 hours is too long, but I don't need to watch it in 45 minutes.
Exactly.
I can carve out 90 minutes.
Yeah, and that was the thing too, right? So I watched the full-length version, and about halfway through, I was like, man, I should really go to the condensed version, just because it seemed like it took a little bit too long. But the thing I did like is you got the analyst's point of view of what was going on, and when we get to game
right,
2,
it is nice to have that.
Yeah, and when we got to game 2, I was kind of blown away at how much the analysts were putting over this Detroit Lions team. It took me.
Yeah, even watching condensed, the thing is, they always do that stuff. But it was funny to hear at one point them say, Lions fans hoping this is the year they get back to the playoffs. And, sitting here knowing it is. But let's not get too far into game 2, and let's jump back into game 1. Game 1 was Detroit at Tampa Bay. It was a 27-20 win for the Lions.
September 11th of 2011.
Yeah, so you would have been exactly 10 years since 9/11, and they referenced that for sure. One of the first things that stood out is I'm curious to see what games I remember, because how much of this game did you remember?
Very little.
There was a Titus Young grab that I remember. I think this was his rookie year.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Titus Young grab I remember, but I don't really remember this game. I think I talked about a little bit of this on our regular Practice Squad podcast last week. A couple things that stood out to me. That's all we're going to do here. It's going to be very free form. But one of the things that really stood out to me was the Lions were 2 tight ends before it was cool. And we look back on Brandon Pettigrew and have our beefs, but the truth was Brandon Pettigrew was a receiving threat tight end early in his career. Tony Scheffler was a guy that they went out, and I don't know if that was his first year, but he played a few years with them. And
first year as a Lion, and
Okay.
He was honestly, I think he was highly underrated, especially on that team.
I think in week 1, they made it it was very clear. If you go back and watch week 1 against Tampa Bay of 2011, it was very clear that the Lions had an emphasis on 2 tight ends. And it's funny because we watched the Patriots do it so well. I don't know if we realized how well the Lions did it. Both guys had over 5 receptions. I want to say accounting for probably close to 120 yards as I try to pull it up right here. Tony Scheffler. Maybe I might be mixing my games up here. Tony Scheffler had only 1 reception in week 1, but it was a touchdown. And then Brandon Pettigrew had 6 receptions for 57 yards. So it wasn't okay. It didn't stand out maybe quite as much as I thought it did, but Tony Scheffler did get a touchdown in week 1. Brandon Pettigrew had 6 receptions as well. And I know as we go along through the season, we're going to see more Tony Scheffler. But that was something that was interesting to me because I don't necessarily – I remember it now thinking back, but it's not something that's been in my mind that the Lions were early to the 2 receiving tight end game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, looking back on it, that didn't stand out to me at all. The one thing that I do remember about this season and about this team specifically was how much we bagged on that offensive line. And watching this first game, I was like, this offensive line isn't half bad.
No,
it's really not half bad.
So I didn't write that down, but I had the same thought. You know what though? Actually, my very first note that I took was we always think of Stafford as a gunslinger, and I think that started in 2011. Mm-hmm. In week 1, I'm wondering, it's going to be really interesting to watch as the season goes on. I thought week 1, he looked like an ultimate West Coast quarterback. I thought he had a hell of a performance, taking what the offense gave him, mostly staying short. He took his shots deep when they were there, but to be honest with you, he struggled with the deep ball, seriously struggled with the deep ball. But in the short passing game, it was all there. So to some extent, that takes, obviously some pressure off the offensive line. The running game was meh. I mean, we know that. Javid Best is another piece that I think we're going to talk about Javid Best a lot through the course of the podcast.
The run game was meh, like you said, but there was an emphasis to run the ball with this team.
Definitely.
They ran it 35 times. And Javid Best, like you said, he's going to be a guy that we highlight
nowadays.
Oh, for real. He's going to be a guy that we highlight as the season goes on because in my notes, I have, let me find it real quick. I have Javid Best always falling forward. He was always one cut away from making everybody miss, and he was always falling forward. He was never getting tackled for a loss. Just watching him play, I was like, man, if he could have just stayed healthy, for real. Martin Mayhew, say what you want about the guy. For the most part, he knew what he was doing when he was drafting these guys. Javid Best, we crushed him for Javid Best because he had the concussion problems coming out of UCLA. But if Javid Best could have stayed healthy, again, ifs and buts were candy and nuts. If my grandma had, freaking nuts, she'd be my grandpa. But Javid Best was a guy who, he was fantastic. And he was what this offense needed.
Well, and I think you have to wonder, too, watching this and seeing the way they weren't great, but they had a run offense, and like you said, they were committed to it. I think you have to wonder how things would have worked out if Mikel LaShore didn't have an Achilles injury, in the preseason of his rookie season. Mm-hmm. Because they ran the ball 33 times? 35 times. 8 of them were with Jerome Harrison. Who the hell is Jerome Harrison? I don't remember him at all.
I vaguely remember him.
I remember everybody else on the Lions offensive list. I mean, everybody else. I do not remember a Jerome Harrison. I thought Jerome Harrison was a linebacker for the Steelers. Who the hell is this guy?
Do you remember? Was it Marcus Morris? You remember Marcus Morris?
No, Marcus Morris was a Piston.
Or Maurice Morris.
Maurice Morris, yes.
I vaguely remember him as well. But again, who's this guy? This was a guy that they basically brought in off a coach.
I think Maurice Morris is, if I remember correctly, that season, I think Maurice Morris ends up becoming the clear-cut number 2 running back.
He does.
Because I don't remember one bit who Jerome Harrison is. So you got to wonder, they committed an early draft pick to Mikel LaShore. what would things have looked like. But your offensive line observation, I saw that as well. Another thing, I don't know if this happens for you, and if you're listening to the podcast and you're kind of trying to decide whether you just want to listen or if you want to watch along with us, one thing I would urge you to consider when thinking about if you want to watch along is, I remember Calvin Johnson being special. There's no doubt about it.
Bro.
But there's something about the way his career ended in like, he wasn't the same physical freak. He was still one of the greatest of all time. He never played a year in which he wasn't an elite wide receiver. But I think, like, mentally, I had lost a little bit of the picture of what made him so special because of how banged up he was late in his career. This is, I think, 25-year-old Calvin Johnson, and week one, it stood out. It was like, I forgot Calvin Johnson was, like, we don't remember, Calvin Johnson had elite running back speed. And we're talking about a dude who was 6'5", with elite running back speed, elite jumping ability. Like, he did everything perfect physically. And week one against Tampa Bay showed it more than I can remember. And I know this because he was young. We're going to see this again throughout the year. So if there's one good reason I can give you why you'd watch along and not just listen, it's to really see what Calvin Johnson was and to remember, like, just how special he really was.
My third note is Calvin is so smooth because he was flawless. Everything looked effortless for him. There was a play.
I think the speed has something to do with it. Like, he just glides across the field.
For sure. I think it was a slant pattern, and he ran between two defenders, and basically he had to look behind him and over his shoulder as he was crossing both these defenders up, and the ball was there. It was a little bit behind him because Stafford was either early or late. Stafford was trying to figure it all out. He looked like Stafford reminded me of a baby buck, right? Of a button buck. He has all the potential in the world, and he's going to be a boss hog if he can put it all together. But he was still trying to figure it out. I think this was his third season, and this was probably his first full season because
it was. His
first 2 years he had injuries, so he was trying to get it all put into place, and you could see he was struggling at times. His first, I think it was like I had Stafford overthrows 5 receivers in the first quarter, and he was just early on every.
And if you were to go back and watch those, that's what I was saying. We think of him as a gunslinger, but those overthrows were almost exclusively deep down the field.
Yeah.
He had literally right off the bat of the game, they get the opening kickoff, and he throws a pass off of, I want to say, Pettigrew's hands, but it was somebody right into the hands of Talib, who returns it for a touchdown.
Yep.
But outside of that, for the most part, his overthrows were deep balls. I thought, while overall, I saw this more in week 2 than week 1, and I don't want to get too deep into it. While overall there's definitely a sense of a young, incomplete quarterback, I thought, looking back on it now, knowing everything I know now, I think watching the Tampa Bay game, you saw that this was a guy with, at the bare minimum, if you asked him to take care of the football and take what the defense gives him, he could do it at a very high level right then and there.
Yes.
Like in 2011, and they asked him to do more than that. But in 2011, if you asked him to just take what the defense gave him, I thought in week 1 he did it at an incredibly high level.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. That one interception, kind of a 50-50 ball as to whose mistake it was.
It probably shouldn't have been an interception. It doesn't get tipped in the air, it's just an incomplete pass.
Exactly. He, at a very high level, you're right, took care of the ball, and he made passes and completions that a lot of quarterbacks who are much more advanced and further along struggle with. And just didn't do a good enough job. You're right. At that,
he did a good job putting the ball in the right places. Like, because of course you expect every quarterback to hit the open 7-8 yard pass, but I thought he did a really good job of hitting tight windows where only the receiver could get it. He took care of the ball, not just by only hitting the open man, but by putting it in safe places in short yardage.
Absolutely right. And this goes back to a conversation we had on the practice squad, which you can hear every single Thursday right here on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. You brought up Josh Freeman, and there was a comparison between Matt Stafford and Josh Freeman. And looking at those two guys go head to head, there should never have ever have been a.
I didn't remember that he was drafted in the first round.
Josh Freeman?
He was the 16th overall pick in the same draft as Stafford. I knew that those two were compared a lot, but I didn't realize he was a first-round draft pick. They brought it up during the broadcast of that game, and I was like, oh, boy. Like, that's embarrassing. And it's so funny to think that there were people who argued both Mark Sanchez and Josh Freeman over Stafford.
Yeah.
And so far and away, the Lions made the right choice in that pick.
You know what really stood out to me was Ndamukong Suh. I felt like Ndamukong Suh in this game was pretty much a non-factor.
Yeah, I thought it was funny you said he stood out because I thought the exact opposite. I found myself going, Suh was on this team, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that exactly. He was a non-factor in almost all of this game. And look, I get it. He was double teamed a lot of the time, but for real, you didn't hear his name called once. It was like he wasn't really involved.
Let's remember one narrative with Suh that I think had his place. Suh came in his rookie year and had a great season, and he didn't disappear, but he was not that same pass rush presence again until his contract year.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right.
His first and last years in Detroit were his best years by far.
Absolutely. You're absolutely spot on. You know what was weird too? Because you got to see a former Lion play very early in his career, and that was LeGarrette Blount. LeGarrette Blount was part of that Tampa Bay team.
It's so funny because I didn't want to get too deep into that, but watching that, Stroz, I was a big LeGarrette Blount fan from day one.
Me too.
And I'm watching like the few carries he got and thinking like, it was so obvious that this guy was going to have a 10, 12, 15-year NFL career. Not 15, he's a running back, but it was obvious he was going to hang around for a long time. But he just beat the crap out of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about this game too was, I felt like Detroit controlled this game on both sides of the ball.
I agree. They only won by 7, but it never felt that close after they got ahead.
Yeah. And looking at what they brought to the table on defense, I mean, they had Chris Houston as one of their defensive backs. They had Amari Spivey. You had Eric Wright. That's your secondary. And then your linebacking core had Steven Tulloch. You had Justin Durant. And that was the first year, maybe it was the second year of DeAndre Levy. So Levy's coming into his own. You had Cliff Averill on an edge. You had Kyle Vandenbosch, who
so it's funny because you sound so nostalgic right now, and that's why I wanted to do 2011. I want to do years that were fun. We haven't decided
how good they were though. Like
we may continue this. Right now, we basically have this scheduled to end when NFL Game Pass runs out, like when the free trial runs out, but we'll see. And if we continue, we'll obviously move on to the next playoff season, 2014. So I have one more note, and it's very similar to yours, but I do have one little bit of beef with what you said. Okay. My last note was I wonder if this defense was a little underrated, because I think when we look back at this defense, or this team, we think Stafford's coming out party, finally had a second wide receiver in Nate Burleson, finally had a little bit of running game in Javid Best. I think we think the defense wasn't good enough and the running game was incomplete. But I'll tell you what, I think the defense might have been a little underrated, and we're going to have to watch and see because I honestly don't know. I'm going to be curious to see how it goes as we get throughout the rest of the season. But I thought they had one clear weakness, and it was the depth in secondary. Chris Houston that year was special.
Yes.
I want to say he was among the top of the league in interceptions. He was very, very good. I'm trying to remember. He might have had one in this game. If he didn't, he definitely had one next week. But Chris Houston was great. I loved Louis Delmas, but he had his weaknesses. I thought Amari
Delmas as well.
Spivey was passable, but not anything special. Aaron Berry. Was it Aaron Berry?
Yeah.
Aaron Berry played a lot of snaps, and he was underwhelming. The secondary had its weaknesses. The defensive line was very strong. And all the names you mentioned, I believe Jason Jones was on this roster. I'm not actually sure of that, so I shouldn't say that with confidence. But Willie Young was on this roster, and he was really good. Yeah, he was really good. Justin Durant, like you said, played at a high level. Colin Vandenbosch, Steven Tulloch. It does not look like Jason Jones
clogging up the middle.
Oh man, Corey Williams. It's funny because I remember Corey Williams of the awful Lions. I think this is probably his last year there. The defensive line hadn't quite gotten to its 2014 levels yet, but that's where Jason Jones was. He's on the 2014 team. But like the defense was very clearly starting to get pieces together, and I think it's funny because we look back at those 2014 Lions, and there was definitely a question of how much of it was Caldwell and how much of it was what the Lions had already put together. And you know what? Looking at this 2011 defense, I think what you see is between Jim Schwartz and Martin Mayhew, they were really starting to put together a special defense. They weren't there yet, but they were on their way.
And the thing is, I think you've seen it in Game 2 against the Kansas City Chiefs, because the Chiefs were so fast.
Let's do this before we get into that.
Okay.
We have awards I want to do for Week 1,
okay,
and then we're going to transition into Week 2.
Let's do it.
So we're going to do this for every game. It's going to be our MVP, our most disappointing player. And if you have any weekly awards you want to just hand out week to week that aren't set in stone, you go for it. But who was your most disappointing player against Tampa Bay Week 1 in the 27-20 win?
It would have to be Ndamukong Suh. I really felt like he was a non-factor in this game. Like I said in my notes, I was like, where is Suh? And I just felt like he never really showed up in this game.
I think that's pretty fair. I went with Brandon Pettigrew, and it's because I said it. We have some negative thoughts of Brandon Pettigrew, and fairly so, but he was a receiving threat. But I think he had 3 drops this game. He had 1 in the end zone, and they had 2 drives stall on passes to him in the end zone. I thought, despite the fact that he had 5 receptions for 57 yards, I thought he showed some early signs of being stone hands, drop-a-grew, I think some of my friends like to call him. All right, who's your MVP?
Calvin Johnson.
Yeah, I don't think that one's debatable.
He, in this game, he stood out. That guy, he didn't eclipse 100 yards in this game, but man, did he feast. And he had a really, really good game. And like you said, we kind of have this vision of Calvin at the end of his career where he was pretty banged up. His fingers were all bent funny, and he had kind of lost a little bit of a step because it just kind of had wore on him. But he was so silky smooth in this game. It was unreal to watch him just get up and down the field and just go against. Look, Talib is an elite at this time, an elite cornerback, and he killed him. He killed him in this game.
Yeah. He didn't have, like you said, he didn't have 100 yards, but he had 2 touchdowns. Yeah. And one of them in particular was a fade where it was all him.
Yes.
He just went up and got the ball, and that was another play where he showed you his peak 25-year-old athletic abilities. I cannot imagine putting anybody else as the MVP for this game. And it'll be fun to see week to week how that changes and if we have disagreements. But I think week 1, Calvin Johnson blew every single other player out of the water. In the first quarter, I found myself leaning towards Javid Best, but I thought even though they stayed on the ground, he kind of disappeared a little bit throughout the rest of the game.
No, you're right. I think he had like 23 carries, and like they force-fed him the rock, and he did a good job picking up yards. But I think it kind of, like, as the game kind of wore on, you kind of see it wear on him a little bit. This was, I believe, Javid Best's rookie year, and his very first game, the guy touched the ball over 20 times. That's a lot for a rookie, and especially a guy who... I
don't think it was his rookie year, because they drafted Mikel LaShore this year, so I think it was his second year.
Okay, but still, that's a lot of carries for a running back, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure.
He touched the ball a whole lot, and I think he gave them enough when they needed it. I just don't think... I expected more. I wanted more.
All right, moving on to week 2. This is a game I think a lot of us will remember, and as soon as I pulled up week 2 of 2009 on NFL Game Pass, I was like, I remember this game. This is going to be fun. The Lions beat the Kansas City Chiefs in the home opener of the season, 48-3. What were your first thoughts watching this game?
Holy hell, they got a defense. Like, legitimately, that was what I thought. I was surprised.
It's so funny. It's going to have to change because going in, you thought this defense wasn't very good, right?
Right.
So what happens in the next 14 weeks?
I don't know. I mean, maybe it's because they got dismantled by the Saints. I don't know. But I remember watching this game, and I had a moment where I remember when Jamal Charles went out. I remember thinking that is very fortunate for this Detroit Lions team, because that first drive that Kansas City had the ball, they move so fast, and they were cutting through that defense like a hot knife through butter. And that defense, it bent, but it didn't break, right? I think this is where that bend but don't break mentality that Detroit Lions fans remember so vividly, I think this is where it came from, because they gave up yards, but they were good enough to keep this team in the game and then force turnovers, and they capitalized on those turnovers. There were 6 turnovers in this game, five at the 14-minute mark of the fourth quarter. Like 14 minutes left in the game, they had 5 turnovers already.
I think that this might be one of the most, I'm trying to think of the word I want to use, not confusing, like misleading scores I've ever seen. Don't get me wrong, the Lions clearly won this game.
Do you think it was because of who their quarterback was? Because this was a Matt
Castle?
Yeah.
Yes.
Matt
Absolutely.
Kansas City.
I think Matt Castle had a lot to do with it. But I think when you watch this game, I think for the first 20 minutes of the game, the Chiefs are overwhelmingly the better team. You can't overwhelmingly be the better team for 20 minutes of a game and lose 48-3. That's not possible. But it happened in this one. And I'll tell you what, going in a different direction, I gave Matt Stafford all the praise in the world in week 1. I thought he was incredibly underwhelming in week 2, and his stats don't say that one bit. I thought, in fact, here, let me see exactly the way I wrote it down. This is word for word what I wrote. I thought this was probably the single most underwhelming offensive 48-point game in NFL history. I thought Stafford was mediocre, but he had 4 touchdowns and almost 300 yards. None of it looked like that. I thought the offense was meh. The defense was good. I think you're probably giving them a little bit too much credit. Matt Castle was atrocious. And the fumbles, some of them, just bounced the way they bounced. You never know what's coming. The defense did get pressure on Matt Castle. And that's one thing through 2 weeks we see. The defense got a lot of pressure. Now, they brought a lot of pressure. Jim Schwartz was very big on blitzing. And my guess is that's what we're going to see, is we're going to see teams adjust to that and get burned because of that later on. But you pressured a bad quarterback and he threw a lot of interceptions. The Lions absolutely deserved to win this game. I'm not trying to sit here and say they didn't. You don't win a game 48-3 on accident. But I remember being there and feeling like, oh my God, this team is real. This is the year. The Lions are real. And I remember all year long I had arguments with specifically one friend about whether the Lions were real or just a product of a bad schedule. And through 2 weeks, I feel like the answer is they are good. But I just don't think, if I saw this game today as a 26-year-old, I'd have looked at it and been like, okay, 2-0 start, happy with what I saw of the defense, but the Chiefs are going to be a really bad football team, and I'm concerned with the way the offense played. Which is why, it was 48-3, but that's the way I'd come out of it today. Right.
I think the thing about this game, right, and why that scoreboard is so just 48-3. That's nuts, right? And at the end of this game, you had Detroit Lions players dumping a cooler of Gatorade on their defensive coordinator. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but I was just. Was it? Yes. And I was just like, okay, what are we doing right now? But the thing about it, and I think what lends itself to that 48-3 score was you had a bad quarterback who capitalized on a very good year and got a very fat contract from Kansas City in Matt Castle. And then you had a very undisciplined Kansas City team.
Oh, so undisciplined. So many big penalties.
So many personal.
Big timings on them a lot of times, too.
It was insane. Just watching it, I was like, oh my God, I've never seen a team this undisciplined besides maybe the Lions. And even the Lions didn't do dumb stuff like this. Like you had guys coming in with late hits, taking late hits on quarterbacks, punching guys in helmets, shoving guys, ripping helmets off. I was like, what is going on here?
I'm pretty sure the ref used the word melee in one,
yes.
in one of the penalties. He said something along the lines of, and it was one of the guys, I don't remember who's been known as a over-describer, but he said, number 76 ripped off his helmet during the melee. It was like melee, or I don't know how he said it, but it was so funny to listen to him use that word in calling a penalty.
Yeah, dude, it was, I think all of that contributed to a Detroit Lions team that really took advantage. And you're right, Matt Stafford looked a little bit pedestrian. This was a game where he threw the ball 40 times, and at no point did he complete his receptions at the efficiency that he did in the game before. This was a game where it felt like they got away from that rushing attack, and I don't know if it was just what the defense was giving them, so it made sense to throw the ball more, but I didn't feel like Matt Stafford was outstanding in any certain way in this game, but still he put up numbers in this game. Like if you had him in fantasy this week, you were pumped, you were excited.
And when you look at what the receivers did, I think it speaks to why the numbers were so inflated. Nate Burleson had 93 yards on 7 receptions. As we remember, Nate Burleson wasn't catching deep balls. He was catching, make something happen. Javid Best, I thought, again, Javid Best really stood out in this game, but for a different reason. Watching this game made me go, wait, did they not use Javid Best enough in the passing game? Because he was special after the catch in this game. 6 catches, 66 yards and a touchdown. Tony Scheffler, again, only 1 reception, but it was a 36-yard touchdown. That was a nice passing play.
It was.
Kelvin Johnson, three receptions for 29 yards and another 2 touchdowns. This game, the game before, in week 1, it felt like Stafford did a good job putting the ball where it needed to be in tight throws in short yardage. In this game, it felt like the vast majority of all the yards came on wide open stuff, and then yards after the catch.
You know what? If you go through and you look at the box score, right? And this is a little bit weird, and I think this kind of runs a little bit counter to what you were saying. If you look, they had 4 different receivers with receptions of almost 30 yards or more. So Nate Burleson's long in this game was 29 yards. Titus Young had a 43-yard reception. I remember that one being way downfield and put them in the red zone to score. Javid Best had a 35-yard reception, and Tony Scheffler had that 36-yarder. Calvin Johnson, I think, in this game was a little bit underutilized, or for some reason the passes just weren't there. They targeted him 7 times. It just, for some reason, they were either high or he had a cornerback in his face. But a lot of things to Calvin Johnson looked like they were a little bit underneath. His longest reception, 15 yards. So it looked like Stafford was trying to open it up downfield in this game, and maybe that's why it was a little bit underwhelming with his.
Again, when he did that, I thought you saw he really struggled with the deep ball.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because, again, maybe some misconceptions we have looking back. Stafford still has a reputation of a gunslinger, and I really think it originated in 2011. You mentioned Titus Young. I thought this was the coming out party for Titus Young. 5 receptions, 89 yards. I think this is, and I remember this season starting to go like, oh boy, this team could get dangerous, because you had a special, not just elite, but like an all-timer in Kelvin Johnson in the prime of his career. Nate Burleson, like I said last week on the practice squad, was Golden Tate before Golden Tate. Not as good, but a very similar style. And Titus Young started to look like a real threat. 5 receptions, 89 yards. And he had, in week 1, like I mentioned, he had a great grab in week 1, but in week 2, he made his presence known.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Titus Young, he was the one who was involved in that early dust-up where Kansas City ended up taking that personal foul.
Melee.
Yeah, and got his helmet ripped off.
Of course. With context looking back, of course.
Yes, no, exactly. But you're right. I think this was a little bit of his coming out party, because really and truly, as far as receiving threats go, Nate Burleson and Titus Young and Javid Best in this game were the guys who carried the bulk of the load for this team. And they did a really good job. This was a game where I think they kind of got after it with some of that run after the catch. I think they helped inflate some of Matt Stafford's numbers, because I don't know where they really would have been if they didn't get loose downfield. This was a game where in my notes here, I had Stafford has a habit of forcing passes and trying to make a play. And I think this is one of those criticisms that we have of Matt Stafford up until probably this last year, and maybe...
Oh, no, it's probably 3 or 4 years, yeah.
So...
Yeah, for a large part of his career.
Yeah, he was trying to make plays, and he was throwing balls into these extremely tight windows, which... He's lucky they didn't get picked off.
I will say this. One thing Stafford's gotten a lot of criticism from throughout his career from people who have hated on him has been that he would just throw it up to Calvin Johnson. He had an all-time great wide receiver, and it's really easy to see how that's memorable. Because I think through 2 weeks he's probably done that 3 or 4 times. But that's the thing; he's only done it 3 or 4 times. And maybe as the season goes on, we'll see it more. But in his first full season, where you'd expect that's what he'd have done, when he'd have done it the most, it feels like he finds himself sometimes in situations where it's nothing's going to happen. Now I'll throw it up to Kelvin, but it's not an overwhelming number of his plays.
No, you're right. You're right. Looking back at my notes right here, I kind of want to transition to the defense. And
I want to say one more thing about Stafford real quick.
Go ahead.
The last thing I wanted to say about Stafford, I thought in this week we saw his willingness to improvise, something he had really well early in his career, kind of lost it for a little bit there, and then I think it's come back the last few years. We saw a willingness to improvise, but I don't think he was anywhere near as good at it then as he is now. I thought a lot of times you saw him rolling out of the pocket and just not having safety valves. So he found himself in situations where he had to throw it deep to Calvin or throw it out of bounds. I want to say in this game he had a scramble where he almost got sacked and he was halfway to the ground when he threw the ball out of bounds, which is it worked, but hella risky.
I know the exact play you're talking about. He was in the grasp of the defender, and they were pulling him down, and I was like, you better get rid of that ball. And he just kind of underhand throws it out of bounds.
and so you saw he was willing to, but I think you saw the youth there.
Yes.
So yeah, you can transition onto the defense.
Yeah, so moving to this defense, one of the notes that I took, and this goes back to something you had said about the secondary and about this team, and you said the secondary you felt was it
lacked depth.
Yeah, it wasn't very complete, and I think that speaks to how good this front seven was.
Yeah, the front seven, I agree with that.
I feel like there was a lot of depth with that front seven, and it was impactful. There were guys who had no problem getting after the quarterback, or like you said, applying all that pressure. And this was a defense with Jim Schwartz, and I think Jim Schwartz had a lot of balls. I think he was a very brash
too many.
Yes, he was a very brash coach, and he was a guy who had really no problem laying it all on the line and just sending the house. And you had guys who would line up in that wide 9, and
yeah, you definitely noticed it this week.
Yes, you do. That wide 9, you basically have defensive ends.
They're just please take the middle, just run it straight up the middle. No one's going to stop you
from sideline to sideline. And he would just had no problem bringing the house. He would bring 7-8 guys all the time. So it really put a lot of pressure on that secondary. But I think that front 7 that he would bring regularly, I think those guys did a fantastic job. And if you were a defensive end or if you were a linebacker, you had to love playing in this scheme.
It was a very deep front 7. I do think the defense as a whole lacked truly elite special playmakers. Chris Houston had a great year, but let's not kid ourselves and think Chris Houston was ever, what Darius Slay is.
Right.
Sue was obviously special, but this was, I don't believe, a special year by him.
I don't him at all.
Stephen Tulloch, great middle linebacker. What they had was a front 7 full of guys who were above average, really good, maybe a great guy here or there. They didn't have did they have a single? Sue was elite, even if he didn't have a great year. Was anybody else on that front 7 truly elite? Cal Vandenbosch was really good. Stephen Tulloch was really good. They had a lot of depth. They were good all across the defensive line, all across the linebackers, but I didn't think that they were special maybe anywhere outside of Sue.
So this particular year, DeAndre Levy, I don't think was too...
Man, what a good linebacking core, though. Right. Levy, Tulloch, and Justin Durant it just felt safe.
Yeah. No,
comfortable.
It was very good. Again, nobody's elite, right? DeAndre Levy, I think, as the years go on, when we get into that 2014 season, I think at that point, he is up there in the top 5, top 10 of linebackers in the league. At this point in time, he's very young. right? But he is so damn good.
Stephen Tulloch's probably the best linebacker in 2011.
Yes, on this team, yes, absolutely. Absolutely, Stephen Tulloch is. And I remember them going out and grabbing guys like Stephen Tulloch and Kyle Van Den Bosch. Like, those guys came from Tennessee with Jim Schwartz. Like, when free agency opened, Jim Schwartz was at these dudes' houses. Like,
that was like the big story.
Yeah.
It went the minute free agency started, he knocked on Kyle Van Den Bosch's door.
Exactly. And do you remember Kyle Van Den Bosch? And they had a great up close picture of this. If you watch the full length version of the game without the commercials, Kyle Van Den Bosch in his red contacts.
Oh, I'll never forget that. I don't need to see the picture. I remember.
I remember
my dad.
Like,
my dad was in love with him because of that. Like, he didn't need to see him play a single snap.
Like, it makes him some elite talent because he's got these red contacts. I just love it.
He's tough. He's going to intimidate the offensive line.
I just loved it. I thought it was fantastic. Something else I took out of this game. John Wendling. I think he was a special teams ace. So look, I don't think.
You know what's so funny is I recognize the name, but I couldn't remember why. And you're probably right. He probably was a special teams ace, and that is probably why I remember him.
Yeah, it was like every play downfield, this guy was making a tackle on special teams. I don't think he was great at any one thing. He was a rotational player. He got put in when guys needed a spell. But this guy on special teams was fantastic. He was one of those guys who ends up winning a job just because of what he can do on special teams, and he's good enough to kind of rotate in on a per play basis, but doesn't really bring anything to the defensive side of the ball. It's all special teams all the time.
All right, you got. I've got all my notes. You got any other notes you need before we wrap up with our awards for week 2?
No, I think I'm good. I mean, I have my one note. I have the O-line is so solid. I was blown away at how good the O-line was again this week.
I wasn't blown away like you were, but I did feel like it was a lot better than I remember.
Dude, that's 2 weeks in a row where this O-line did not give up a sack at all, nor a tackle for loss. So I think that's pretty good for this offensive line.
All right, so our awards for week 2, again, 48-3 win over the Chiefs in week 2 of the 2011 season for the Detroit Lions. Who was your most disappointing player in this game?
Oh, man, disappointing. It would probably be Cliff Averill, because this was a game where this defense absolutely feasted on the quarterback, right? Matt Castle's not fantastic. Cliff Averill's out there playing the edge, and I think we forget how good Uncle Cliffy was at this point in his career, right? He was just not impactful when everybody else was putting up huge numbers on the defensive side of the ball.
I want to say he might have been a Pro Bowler this year. Not that that's any special measure. It's definitely not the number one measure you use, but it's worth noting. I think he might have been a Pro Bowler this year. I had Stafford. And maybe I'm judging him from a harsher angle because I've been a Stafford fan from day one. And like, you can't look at 2011 and say it was a bad season. The guy threw 41 touchdowns and 16 interceptions in his first full year as a starter, because he was obviously hurt the 2 years before. But I thought that his stat line was so misleading. I thought he threw far more bad passes than he did good passes in this one. This is a game where, again, if I was 26 years old watching it, that would be part of my concern, is what the hell was going on with Stafford. I don't care what his numbers said. He wasn't that good. Who was your MVP?
In this game, Javid Best.
He was so good as a pass catcher in this game.
He did it on both sides of the offensive ball here. The guy ran it pretty well, scored a touchdown. He also had 6 receptions, like you said, 66 yards and a TD. You really see his pass-catching ability come to the forefront in this game. And again, I think you start to see what they wanted to do with this offense and how they wanted to create it and how they wanted to use these guys. A guy like Javid Best, that pass-catching dual threat running back. So, I mean, he was not a 3-down back. There was no way he was staying in there on third down to pass block, even though he wasn't a bad pass blocker, but he just wasn't going to do that. He was your first and second down guy, and he could cut you up either in the run game or he could cut you up in the pass game, and you've seen it in this game.
My MVP was Matt Castle.
It was the 3 interceptions, huh?
Yeah. And I thought, aside from the 3 interceptions, he was terrible. I mean, the dude threw for 116 yards in a 2011 NFL football game. In a game he lost 48-3, he threw for. Just understand, he was so bad.
He was so bad in this game.
That in a game they lost by 45, they only trusted him to throw the ball 22 times.
But this was also a team where you had Todd Haley who loved to run the ball.
You lost 48-3, though.
I get it.
If it was a 7-point game, Stroz, that's one thing. Seriously, if I was watching the Lions game, they lost by 45, and Stafford threw the ball 22 times, I'd throw my TV through the window. Matt Castle was so bad in this game, and if you need me to give credit to somebody, it's the secondary. The secondary, who I have said was a little not underwhelming, just not deep. They had Chris Houston, but they weren't deep. But at the end of the day, as bad as Matt Castle was, they made plays multiple times, and it's why the Lions won the game the way they did. They would not have won 48-3 because of their offense. They did it because of the defense. So if you want to give it to Matt Castle, that would be who I'd say. But if you needed to count it as a Lions secondary, I'm okay with that as well.
I'm cool with whatever way you want to go. Because Matt Castle
is my Lions MVP.
He was dreadful. He was dreadful in this game. Next week we get a tight one against Minnesota. Lions are on the road taking on Minnesota, and then after that we get a close one against Dallas, where again they're on the road, and then after that it is probably one of our highlights as far as moments when we go to week 3 of doing this with the Chicago homestand game. So the next 2 weeks look really promising with this podcast. I'm gonna be honest with you.
I think not to tell you not to listen to week 2, not only do you get the amazing game of Lions-Bears, but you get Handshake Gate the following week.
Oh, you do. That's right. I didn't even look that far ahead. So
this was fun, and we're only going to have more fun as we go. Hopefully you're at least listening along with us, but if not, not if not, I hope you watch along with us as well.
Hey, man, this was a great idea. You did a really good job coming up with this, because kudos to you for
it's fun.
You should do this.
It's fun. We got no sports. Let's watch some Lions football. Preferably Lions football that they win. That's going to do it. Again, this is the Practice Squad Throwback.